Hello everyone, welcome to another discussion video. In the last video, we discussed formal qualifications for getting a job in security. This is kind of a second parter to that, where we'll be talking about some of the informal things you can work on to help with getting a job, putting the degree and certs and stuff like that aside. So, what we're talking about here is what looks good on a resume. So, there's a few things here that I think can fit. One of which I think is CTFs. So, I think we can go into a bit of a discussion around that. When it comes to CTFs for putting it on a resume, do companies or hiring departments look closely at what type of CTF it is and how reputable it is? Like Plaid CTF, for example, is generally more highly regarded in the CTF community than some like startup CTF that just started this year or something. Does that does the CTF the type of CTF you participate in matter for that?
I'd say there's certain degree where name recognition matters when you're kind of looking at it and you recognize like, okay, if they've, won, a DEF CON main game, that's going to stand out more than ASDF, CTF. I don't know if that's a real one or not, but like some random named CTF, which maybe isn't as competitive. It's still nice to see like CTF just being listed as a thing that they're doing because it shows that they're interested in it outside of just getting paid.
Yeah, no,
So
I agree. I think overall, when somebody's listing CTF, what I'm trying to get out of it is what experience out of that CTF relates to the job they're applying for. And like you said, if somebody says that they were on the finals of DEF CON CTF, I know that at that point that they must be, or at least they're on a team of people that are relatively strong at low level stuff and reversing and exploit dev. Now, if they just start listing um, miscellaneous CTFs, like I don't really know what that is telling me, other than that they're interested and they're driven and that they're doing this stuff during their personal time, which is all great. But I would probably dive into that to figure out exactly what they enjoy out of the CTF and where they prioritize. Because I know there's some teams out there where somebody like they might be doing CTFs, but they're still only doing like one category.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And like, obviously there's not going to be an expectation for anybody to list CTFs. I would really only say, listing CTFs if you've actually like won the CTF and it's reasonably recognizable or done very well. Not like, came in 100th place during DEF CON quals.
I was about to
Yeah,
ask, do you think there's a point where you should leave it off your resume if you didn't win it, or at least come in like top 10 or something?
Yeah, I don't think it's worth mentioning if you didn't do quite well. I will
Okay.
say though, there is that kind of leads into doing like CTF write-ups. So say if you have a blog and you publish write-ups, that I think can be of value. Just somebody reviewing the resume may or may not have the time to actually look at that, but it is something that can be looked at and like see like what type things they're doing, what type things they have experience with, and that can actually tell quite a bit. If you don't have some of your own findings, CTF write-ups I think are fair game, especially when you're just kind of getting your foot in the door.
yeah, I'd love to see something like CTF write-ups from somebody. I also think that just listing, participating in CTFs as a hobby or side thing on the resume is good in my mind. I
That's
mean,
fair, yeah.
like saying like they won, like it's like okay, but generally, if you're winning, you have a team of people that are very experienced. Like that doesn't really tell me, um, like who this person is and what they're diving into, but it tells me that they're interested, right?
Yeah, and
It's a nice talking point, and it's a great opportunity for them. Basically, if you want to talk about your experience playing CTFs and you want to talk about the things that you've done on them and why it's relatable to what you're applying for, you should put it on the resume. If you don't want to be asked about it, then leave it off.
yeah, I guess I would kind of clarify too with I think there's a difference between listing that you just do CTFs and you play in them like that. Even if you're not winning them, I think listing it's, fair game. I just meant like it looks a little bit off when somebody does list if they're either winning but only like these really random CTFs, or they're doing well in those, or if they're listing like they came in 300th place in something. Like, I guess that's more what I meant. Like, if you just list that you play CTFs, like, that's kind of its own thing versus listing out the specifics.
Yeah, like I've seen people put like finalist for X, and I didn't even know what X was. So, I mean, to me, like them stating that they were a finalist and it wasn't didn't really add much to it. But I just asked them to expand on it and what their role was, right?
Yeah. And that's where I think the write-ups can be a little bit more useful, because you can see that without needing to ask. You can see what their write-ups look like, what type of issues they were dealing with.
Yeah.
So I do want to jump on something you said, Droogie, because it reminded me of something that I totally forgot. I was recommended to by a company that I actually went through an interview process with. Was or rather somebody that works for the company that I eventually interviewed. Basically, when you put something on a resume, like what you were saying with CTFs, and if you don't want to be asked about it, don't put it on there. That is one piece of advice that I think is golden that doesn't get shared enough, is the fact that don't lie on your resume or don't embellish things too much, because if you put it on the resume, your hiring man, your people interviewing you are going to have that material, and they are going to probe you on what you put there. So if you put that you have like 10 years of experience exploiting IoT or something, and then they ask you IoT based questions and you can't answer anything, that looks horrible on you. So don't set yourself up for failure, I guess, by putting things on the resume that think make you look good, but you don't actually like do or have a lot of knowledge in, because you're just gonna end up screwing yourself up in the actual interview process.
Yeah, I mean, just don't lie on your resume.
Yeah, that's the TLDR, I guess.
And
Um,
especially kind of in security, you're likely to run to background checks too. So while not everything could be caught by a background check, it definitely is a lot worse to, lie on your resume, get caught in a background check and lose your job, rather than just being upfront about what your background is.
yeah.
Yeah, and at least for me, if I'm interviewing somebody and they list a ton of skills, and once I start digging into it, then I quickly realize that they're not experienced in it, then they let on. Um, it does leave kind of like a bad taste in the mouth a little bit. But a lot of that depends on how they handle the situation as well. Like if they're able to break it up and tell me the areas that they are experienced in and the areas that they're weak on and where they want to grow. Um, that's great to me. Or if they can't necessarily answer something, but they'll say how they would go find the answer and lead to it, other than like I'd Google it or something. But like some sort of methodology or approach that kind of tells me this person is somewhat experienced in this area, but they're self-taught, so they're not going to know everything. I don't find that as negative. I think it's good that the person's able to speak that way. For some reason, at least early on in this industry, I felt like there's kind of like a stigma where people are terrified to tell somebody that they might not know something. And that leads to toxic environments, in my opinion, where it's impossible to work with the person because they're not going to be upfront and they're going to be kind of hiding things because they don't want you to maybe find out that they're maybe looking something up, or they're not as knowledgeable on something that they let on. And I feel like just communicating correctly and being a team player is the most important kind of things that I'm looking for.
Yeah, that feels almost like, talking a little bit about the imposter syndrome, and just like, looking everything up because you feel like everybody else is already knows that. And it's like, I am just so terrible at my job. I did want to mention, or kind of carry on with your point though. One thing is, instead of embellishing, like, if somebody's kind of honest on like a resume or whatever, and their experience with something is literally they just followed some tutorial online, especially again somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience, like, hey, I work through this like workshop from somebody, like, I think that's fair, to straight up just say that and be clear about the level of experience you have, rather than trying to be like rephrasing it, like, rather than following this tutorial, it's like, well, I have experience doing these tasks, or like just phrasing it in a way that sounds like it's more the embellishment. And then you dig into it and you hear like, okay, they actually just followed a tutorial. kind of getting that disappointment rather than just being upfront about it.
Yeah, at least for me, I'd much rather have them be upfront about it because somebody telling me, well, I listen to these podcasts and I read these blog posts a lot and I follow these specific people and I read their research. And so I understand what they're doing and I understand the concept of this thing because I read about it, but I never actively did it myself. Like, that's fair to me. That shows me that the person is trying to learn and they just haven't had the opportunity to gain the experience. That's a positive net that I see that the person's driven.
Yeah, and I just think it comes out as very, very much a negative when you realize that they just lied about something or like
Yeah,
were very misleading. Like I
like
would,
they just put like read a blog once and put it up there, and it's just like, oh, okay,
yeah, like that's kind of what I'm saying to avoid. Like I think the industry is kind of small enough that a lot of the interviews at least tend to feel a bit more personal, a little bit more about the person's involved with it rather than just like somebody at corporate interviewing you. And so I kind of look at it as just like you're building that relationship during your interview. Odds are, person interviewing you is actually going to be somebody you're working with, rather than like that's not always true, of course, but like you don't want to leave a bad taste in somebody's mouth right off at the start.
I can kind of
yeah,
attest to that. I don't know if I've gotten lucky. Admittedly, I haven't done like, 10 interviews or something, but in the interviews that I have had, all of them were technical people. So there were definitely like cool discussions to be had there, and I didn't feel like I was having to dumb things down or anything like that. So yeah, that is one thing I do really like about this industry, at least from what I've seen, is that you do get more of those interesting interviews instead of like the copy paste regurgitation type interviews, I guess.
I mean, having a
yeah.
project you're interested in, I think, is really kind of valuable. Hearing, I love hearing somebody who's passionate about something talk about whatever it is. I don't actually care if it's security related, but just in general, I love hearing somebody who's just passionate about a topic, just go off on it. And so, if you're able to do that about some security project, that's another thing. It's just your own personal projects, even if it's only tangentially related. Like maybe you're applying for more of the vuln research or more just AppSec general security stuff, consultant, whatever. And you're maybe not going to be doing a lot of reverse engineering in that position, but you have a RE project that you've done, you're able to talk about. Like that's a huge plus, just having those sorts of personal projects.
100%. Um, no, for me, it's always kind of seeing somebody who's driven, who's actively working on stuff. It's fun to see them getting excited about something. They want to grow. They want to learn. It's a lot more comfortable to hire somebody who has less experience, who has a personality like that, and had an interview like that, than somebody who's kind of being very timid and kind of selling, selling snake oil, and you're just kind of seeing the lies, I'd much rather hire somebody who's a little more junior that's willing to learn and work with others and be a team player than I would to hire somebody who's more experienced but doesn't really want to be a team player and just kind of solo.
Yeah, I mean that kind of comes down to just like a culture fit too. Like this is a team job for the most part. You can do individual research, you can work on your own, but you have to be able to work with other people, or at the very least you're going to have to deal with your clients and all of that. Like there's very few places where, unless you're doing like the independent research, where you're actually going to just be on your own. So that culture fit, that just being a good person to work with, maybe realizes that they don't know everything, that aren't going to come across really arrogant. That's something that's definitely kind of looked for during that interview process.
Yeah, and something that you said earlier, I forget exactly what it was, but it made me think, maybe it was the imposter syndrome stuff, and just kind of uh, somebody being willing to say that they might not know the answer to something. Um, the most intelligent people, uh, the fastest exploit writers I've ever met, and reverse engineers, and just really, really smart guys that I've worked with in this industry have had extensive I don't want to say databases, but just like directories of resources to reference, because they don't commit everything to memory. Like they're always going to be referencing stuff, and they know exactly where to look and what to look at, and off the cuff they might not be able to answer exactly what you're saying or what you're asking for, but they can get to the answer in 30 seconds because they have the experience and they've done it before. Um, and I think that's extremely valuable. I think people put too much pressure on themselves for kind of trying to memorize things that just aren't really relevant,
Yeah,
and then too much stress on not being able to recall that
that's something I think
topic.
could have come up during our first discussion, but adding on to it, research is a huge part of this job too. It's you're learning about everything as you go a lot of the time. You spend a lot of time doing research. And that, I guess, tying it in with this one, the informal things, is if you can document your research somehow, conference presentations, believe it or not, even without working in the industry, you can, do some conference presentations. Maybe you won't be at DEF CON, but having some of those presentations is, again, another nice thing to see. And it's just a way of going from that research that you've maybe done on your own, that you worked out and figured out, and, share it with people.
I
And
just want to
that's,
say,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, that ability to be able to know what you know and what you don't know and how to search for what you don't know is a skill in and of itself. There is there are people that I've talked to that have done interviews, and they've interviewed people, and when they ask, "Okay, you come across an issue that you don't know how to solve it. What do you do?" And some of them will answer like, "Oh, I'll just wait for a coworker or for you to come back and I'll ask you." Like that is a terrible answer. As much as you may feel dumb googling something, knowing what like how to find out what you don't know is like an extremely valuable skill and probably an underrated skill, I think.
Yeah, and I would say kind of expand on the how you would research it. Don't say like I'd Google it, right? But like expand what you're looking for, and why you're looking up that thing, and why you believe it will lead to your answer. But yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah.
Kind of tying back in with the informal qualifications, I guess one, probably the last thing I'd want to add in here is if you have findings, CVs, or just actual findings, obviously looks good on a resume. If you're applying for a job to, do security and assess security on some type of issue, and you can show like I found these issues in real software that's actually being used, looks great. Now, if your CV, look it up and it's, some, I don't know what type,
CSRF.
CSRF on the logout button. And I mean, to be fair, like there are some attacks you can do with that, but like if that's the extent of your findings, maybe not. But having some actual CVs under your name look good, and you can do that without working in the industry. I think a lot of people, focus on they're still learning and they never actually bother trying to attack real targets. And I think that's just a mistake. Like once you've learned your basics, just jump in there. You can find issues. There's still a lot of insecure software out there.
To
Yeah,
that
no,
point, how far would you go with that? Because if you let's say you have like 15 or 20 CVEs on, under your name, you don't want to list like a full page of CVE identifiers for the hiring person to look up, right? Like how many would you say max would you want to put on there? Like your best 3 or something?
Give the headlines. I mean, again, it's one of those things. Which ones are cool to talk about? Because odds are you
yeah.
list them, interviewer's going to be asking you about them. Which are you going to be? Which do you want to talk about? They don't have to be the highest impact. It's just what was a cool vuln.
So the few you find the most interesting is
That's what
probably a good
I'd
baseline.
say.
Yeah, 100%. Like I've had that where years ago I used to ask this question. I don't really ask it much anymore, but I used to ask people like, "Oh, what's the coolest type of vulnerability you've ever found?" And I mean, there were times where, like, I remember specifically this one person talked about this really interesting race condition that was super, super neat. The impact was like low. It was like the impact wasn't really there. He had way more critical issues to talk about, but but this issue itself, just the way it was discovered and everything was like a really interesting story, and it was fun to hear, you know. So there's more value than just impact in terms of what you're discussing during the interview.
It's funny you mentioned that question as something you'd ask candidates, because when I'm interviewing somewhere, that's a question I tend to ask, like whoever's interviewing me, is tell me a little bit about the coolest thing they found while they're, in the line of their work or something. Just kind of have
Yeah,
that discussion, but
yeah, I tend to. I guess we'll kind of get back
well,
into
yeah, we'll
to
have
those later.
another discussion on that. I just thought it was an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I guess across the board, in terms of what I'm expecting out of the resume informally is, if the person does not have work experience, it's just kind of hard learned things that are relevant, and yeah, all that stuff is valuable. If they have a GitHub repo with a project that they developed that is you know, a bot for some game that, is not security related at all, but like that's still interesting for them to discuss or talk about. It shows me that they're passionate and we can kind of dig into it and I can start asking questions. And anything along those lines. I think the CVE stuff, for some reason there's this like funny drama in the industry where people like bash CVEs for some reason and CVE numbers and stuff, and they try to pretend like they're not as valuable as they are, and I think it really just comes down to, look, if you want CVEs, go get them. Nobody's stopping you from going to get them, and but in the end, like we said before, just because it's a CVE doesn't necessarily mean it's relevant or you want to showcase it, but the stuff that you want to talk about that is interesting and probably the most technical or that showcases this skill set that you want to show off, that would be the ones that I would say to express.
Yeah, I guess if people are going against the CVs, you've just got to name all your vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
I think part of that, memeability that comes with CVEs is the fact that sometimes there are CVEs that get created for things that are just kind of a joke. We've definitely covered some on the podcast before. I don't really have a hard example to point to, but there's definitely uh, there was a HackerOne report we covered recently, actually, where they were talking about encrypted credentials being in a repository, and the credentials were encrypted. They knew they were there, but yet they still tried to get like a CVE for it. So there are like those are the types of reasons I think that people kind of discredit CVEs or don't look at them as favorably as they should be.
Yeah, so that report actually, it was the public key. It was the fact that the public key was in the repository that they were reporting. I remember
Yeah,
thinking it
that's
was the
right.
encrypted key.
Yeah, so it was
Um,
even worse. It was literally
Yeah,
a
it's
public key, and they tried to report it. So yeah,
yeah, I think that just comes down to people using their head when they're analyzing the situation. If somebody comes to me and they say I have 100 CVEs, it's like, okay, well, let's dig into your top five. Like let's go. Like, yeah, you can't really necessarily just take it on count. But if somebody says I have 100 CVs, I automatically know they've looked at a lot of things, right? Um, but that doesn't mean that the quality is great. But I mean, the purpose of a CVE is not for somebody to get a a private bug track number that they can put on a resume or tweet out. The purpose is to help an industry, kind of do vuln management, right? So there's a reason that they exist, and there's a reason that they're categorized a certain way. Same with CVSS. But yeah, I think at that point it's just, at some point the human on the other side needs to decipher the information. If they're incapable of deciphering the information, they probably shouldn't be interviewing or doing that position, right?
yeah.
yeah. So overall, out of all the informal qualifications we've talked about, I feel like passion projects are probably the most important. I feel like those, especially when you get into the interview process, those have the highest ability to have interesting discussion that looks good on you. So if you had to pick one out of the list to like focus on, I feel like passion project, finding something that's interesting, writing up project on it, writing up a tool or something, putting it on GitHub. I think that's probably your best bet is doing something like that,
I mean,
or just
that's
Yeah,
a
nice.
write up about something you're interested in too.
Yeah, the thing about the passion project that's nice is if you start asking them details, like technical details that they're struggling to answer, at least there's an opportunity for them to say, well, hey, let's go look at my code base. I wrote all this code. Like, ask me a question in here and I'll be able to tell you what it is, because they might be self-taught. They're not super experienced. They know some things but not all things. So for me it's like a great way to kind of dig into what the person has learned, and yeah, and then since it's something that they're passionate about and excited about, and ideally they wrote it all, it's a perfect opportunity for them to kind of shine.
Yeah, it's a great source of insight.
yeah. I mean, the only thing I'd kind of add in here though is that the passion projects can look good on the resume, but they shine mostly in that interview process when you're able to talk about it. And that's where the write ups, they can kind of, you can quickly glance and get an idea for a candidate based on those write ups that they have. Um, it's harder to do that just with, well, it depends on the project itself, but it can be a little bit hard to do that just based off of like your passion projects. But there's a balance there. I don't think either is necessarily better or worse. They just apply in different ways.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think you're trying to make sure that it's focused based on what you're applying for, right? There's certain passion projects out there that um, would be more relevant than others. So yeah, I think you should try to analyze what knowledge was required for this project to that can be kind of relatable to what I'm interviewing for, and if that's uh, you know
Yeah, I
just
mean,
a pen
tailor your
testing role,
resume.
or yeah, exactly.
I think that's a good point to end on. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with a follow-up video regarding, the technical skills that are looked for, which we kind of touched on in this video, but we'll go through again, and as well as the typical process of the interview process, because there are some things that seem to be specific to tech that I haven't really encountered in other areas for interviewing. So yeah, we'll talk about that and some questions about what could help you a lot in the interview process as a final point. But yeah, we will get into that in 2 weeks. We also have the podcast on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, live streamed. These discussion videos go up on Thursdays at 8 a.m. Eastern, and we will see you guys in the final discussion video for hiring and getting a job in the security industry.